Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At my promotion dinner, when the waiter had just finished pouring the wine and my colleagues raised their glasses in my honor, my dad leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk he reserved for moments when he thought he was the cleverest man in the room. He chuckled, not loudly, but with enough weight to cut through the sound of clinking glasses, and said, "Too bad your sister couldn't make it. She's the real star." The words slid across the table like a knife, casual and cruel at the same time, and even though I had been conditioned for years to brace myself for these moments, it still felt like my chest tightened with the sting of old wounds. For a second, I thought maybe no one had noticed, but then I caught the quick glance from my boss, Richard, a man not easily rattled, who had spent decades negotiating contracts and managing egos larger than skyscrapers. He gave the faintest of smiles, the kind that meant he had been waiting for just this opportunity, and slowly pulled out a folded letter from his suit pocket. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Funny," he said, fixing my father with a steady look. "She thought so too, until I fired her today." The room went silent, forks suspended, wine glasses hovering midair. My father's face, usually flushed with authority, drained to a sickly pale as though the blood had been vacuumed out of him in an instant. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, even though inside I could feel the sharp satisfaction rising like a tide. For years my family had made a sport of holding me against Rachel, the golden child, the one with the dazzling laugh and the effortless charm. The one my father paraded around at neighborhood barbecues while I was the child tasked with carrying folding chairs and making sure the cooler was stocked. I had spent most of my adult life working twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, carefully building a career brick by brick while Rachel strutted into opportunities handed to her with little more than a wink and a toss of her hair. And yet here I was, sitting at the head of the table during a dinner thrown in my honor, with the title of director newly etched beside my name, and there was my father, still unable to resist one more jab, one more reminder that I would never be Rachel. The silence at the table stretched longer than comfort allowed. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending to examine the menus again, others fixing their eyes firmly on their plates as if studying the pattern of the porcelain might offer escape. My mother coughed into her napkin, a delicate attempt to diffuse the tension, but her eyes darted nervously toward my father, who seemed frozen in place. Richard, however, was composed, almost pleased, like a conductor waiting for the final note of a symphony to fade. "It's never easy to let someone go," he continued smoothly, "but sometimes choices make themselves. And your daughter's choices, unfortunately, caught up to her." He folded the letter back into his pocket with deliberate calm, the way one might put away a weapon after it had served its purpose. I could feel the heat rise up my neck, not from embarrassment this time, but from the electric thrill of seeing the untouchable pedestal crumble beneath Rachel. I lifted my glass, looked directly at my father, and said, "Well, I suppose it's a good thing at least one of us had something worth celebrating tonight." A few people laughed, though it was the uneasy laughter of those caught between loyalty and politeness. My father did not laugh. He pressed his lips together, the muscles in his jaw twitching, and looked down at his plate as though the salmon had personally offended him. Dinner carried on in a strained rhythm after that, conversations forced and stilted, laughter punctuated by awkward silences. I answered questions from colleagues about my plans in the new role, described the strategies I intended to implement, and nodded at compliments about how well-deserved this moment was. All the while, I watched my father out of the corner of my eye, saw how he pushed his food around without eating, how he avoided looking at anyone directly, how the man who had always been the loudest in any room now seemed reduced to a husk of himself. My mother tried valiantly to smooth the edges, asking about dessert, telling stories from when I was little, but her voice wavered, betraying her own discomfort. When the plates were cleared and the bill discreetly taken care of, we all stood outside the restaurant beneath the amber glow of the streetlights. The night air was cool, but I felt warm with a mixture of triumph and unease. My father lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in years, and stared at the ground. He didn't say a word to me, not congratulations, not even goodbye. My mother gave me a stiff hug and whispered, "You know he didn't mean it," but her words rang hollow. Because he had meant it. He had always meant it. And now, for the first time, the ground had shifted under his feet, and he didn't know how to stand. As I got into my car, Richard clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Enjoy tonight. You've earned it. But be ready, because family doesn't take losing lightly." His words echoed in my mind on the drive home, mingling with the image of my father's pale face. I had finally gotten what I wanted: recognition, respect, a seat at the head of the table, but I knew this was only the beginning. The fallout was coming, and in some twisted way, I was ready for it. Because while Rachel had been fired, and while my father had been humiliated, I hadn't even played my full hand yet. And when I did, the silence at that dinner table would seem like nothing compared to what was coming next. The night after the dinner unraveled like a bad rerun of every family holiday I had ever endured, only this time the audience was larger and the stakes were laid out in polished silver and candlelight. So when my phone lit up near midnight with my father's name pulsing across the screen, I already knew the cadence of his opening line, the tooting breath, the disappointed pause, and the weary declaration that I had ruined a perfectly good evening by making everything about me when I should have shown more grace, more humility, more understanding for what Rachel must be going through, as though I had staged the entire promotion just to embarrass his favorite child rather than claw my way up a ladder that never stopped greasing its rungs. He didn't ask how I felt, he didn't say congratulations, he didn't even pretend to care that for once I had been the center of the room. He wanted a confession that I had enjoyed the spectacle, that I had relished the moment his pride cracked in public. And I let the silence hang long enough for him to fill it with his own conclusions, because the thing about my father was that he always preferred a story he could control, and I had finally learned that saying less made him say more. I slept in clipped stretches, not because of guilt, but because my mind kept looping the old footage of Rachel's soft landings, the internships that appeared out of thin air, the mentorships that arrived like gift baskets, the family introductions that greased doors I was told to push on harder if I wanted them to budge, and by morning the muscle memory of that imbalance had pulled every nerve tight again. So I made coffee that tasted like resolve and sat down at my kitchen table to finish something that had been in motion long before the waiter poured the first glass of wine. There is a particular kind of arrogance that blooms when someone has never felt consequences, and Rachel, who drifted into our firm through a referral that wore our father's cologne, treated boundaries like suggestions and rules like mood lighting, which meant that in the months leading up to my promotion she had taken credit for an internal concept memo she did not write, pushed confidential drafts to a private email so she could brag to friends about living on the inside, and requested a vendor lunch that looked suspiciously like a personal shopping day, and I had quietly kept the receipts, not because I wanted to be a cop, but because I was tired of being told that the difference between us was talent when the truth was simply that I refused to color outside the lines while she thought the lines were for other people. Richard had not fired her on a whim. He had read the pattern like an analyst, noted the frequency, measured the slope, and let the math do the talking, and I had helped him see the slope by packaging what was already there into a story that could not be ignored. Which is to say that my revenge, if we insist on calling it that, was not a trap so much as a mirror held at the right angle, though I would be lying if I said the reflection didn't please me in a way that felt almost physical. Yet, even mirrors leave fingerprints, so I opened my laptop and finished the one thing I had left undone out of some lingering reflex for mercy. I forwarded the clean, chronological binder of policy violations to compliance, not with a flourish, not with a vindictive note, but with a simple cover line that any auditor would respect, because what I wanted, more than the thrill of a dramatic takedown, was the integrity of process to do the talking for me, and because I knew that once compliance recorded the pattern, the settlement Rachel assumed she would negotiate on charm alone would shrink to something far less comfortable. By noon the family group chat had erupted with messages that veered between sanctimony and melodrama, and my mother, whose peacekeeping always came with a cost to whoever could withstand it better, asked whether I might apologize for the tone of what I had not even said, whereas my aunt contributed a novella about sisterhood that sounded suspiciously lifted from a daytime talk show, while Rachel, in a private thread, fired off a string of accusations about how I had poisoned Richard against her, how I had spread lies about a harmless lunch, how I had always been jealous and small, words that would have landed if they had not been the same dull arrows she had used since high school. I told her, as evenly as I could, that I had shared facts, not feelings, and that if she considered consequences a smear campaign, perhaps the smear was of her own making, which is when she pivoted to a threat that was meant to shake me. She said she had something on me too, something I wouldn't want the board to see, something about an email from years ago that, read the wrong way, could be a problem, and I felt the floor tilt for a heartbeat before I remembered the one protection Rachel had never respected, which was documentation that did not bend to charm. I drove to the office with that old familiar knot in my stomach, the one that formed whenever I was forced to choose between being the bigger person and being a person at all, and I chose, again, to be specific rather than noble. Which is why I spent the afternoon with our communications lead drafting the internal announcement of my promotion in a way that meticulously credited the more junior analysts whose ideas Rachel had skimmed for shine. And then I sent each of those analysts a separate note with proof of their authorship captured in version histories and calendar invites, small acts that restored what had been siphoned and also ensured that if Rachel ever claimed the work as hers again, she would run straight into a wall of timestamps and signatures. It was not loud revenge, it was not cinematic revenge, but it was the kind that sticks, because people remember who gave them their names back, and they are less likely to believe a thief if they still have their wallets. When I finally stepped out into the evening, my phone buzzed with an email from compliance confirming receipt and asking a few clarifying questions that were easy to answer, a neutral tone that told me the process had clicked into place, and then, almost immediately after, a text from an unknown number arrived with a single photo attached, a grainy screenshot of an old draft I had once sent to Rachel for feedback at the start of my career, back when I still believed collaboration meant something in our family, and beneath the image a line that made the air go thin. Funny how authorship looks when you crop the names. By the time the weekend settled in, the fallout from Rachel's firing had spread like smoke seeping under every door, impossible to contain, and each conversation I walked into carried a trace of it, whether in the forced brightness of colleagues' greetings, the way neighbors tilted their heads with rehearsed sympathy, or the clipped tone of my father's voicemails that arrived in pairs as though he believed persistence alone could bend reality back in his favor. I had not returned a single call, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I knew that once I gave him an opening, he would twist the narrative into a parable of betrayal where Rachel was a victim, I was the villain, and he, as always, was the tragic patriarch burdened with two ungrateful daughters. The truth, of course, was far less theatrical. Rachel had been coasting for years, ignoring warnings, leaving trails of carelessness, and I had simply stopped sweeping up the mess behind her. Yet in my father's eyes, omission was indistinguishable from sabotage, and silence was guilt wearing different clothes. I sat at my desk on Saturday morning with a pile of documents open, reviewing the projects I would inherit now that Rachel's position had been terminated. Some were half-finished contracts, others were presentations riddled with vague bullet points and buzzwords, but no substance, the kind of shortcuts she had always favored because substance was heavy and shine was light. Each file I opened was another piece of proof that her collapse had been inevitable, but it also reminded me how close she had come to dragging me down with her, because 2 months earlier she had attempted what she probably thought was a clever maneuver. She had submitted a version of my project plan under her name during a leadership review, banking on the assumption that I wouldn't confront her directly since our father always demanded that I let it go for the sake of harmony. I remembered sitting in that conference room, flipping through the packet with my own research repackaged in her words, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, and realizing that if I stayed quiet yet again, I would lose more than recognition, I would lose my future. That was the day I began assembling the binder of evidence, not with glee, but with the calm of someone who finally chooses to stop drowning in silence. On Sunday evening, my father finally broke through my refusal to answer with a message short enough to be read in one breath. Come by the house tonight. We need to clear the air before this gets worse. I knew clear the air in his vocabulary meant confess and apologize until my version of events feels restored, but something in me wanted to see his face when he tried to defend Rachel again. Wanted to hear the cracks in his certainty now that the golden image he had polished for decades had been publicly tarnished. So I drove over, rehearsing not an apology, but a list of facts, ready to anchor myself in what was real rather than drown in the tide of his disappointment. The house looked the same as it always had, neat hedges and a porch light glowing steady, but stepping inside felt different, as though every framed photograph on the walls carried the weight of judgment. My mother met me in the kitchen, her hands busy with dishes that didn't need washing, her eyes darting like someone trying to read two scripts at once, one of loyalty to her husband and one of concern for me. She whispered, "Don't push too hard," which only confirmed that my father was waiting with sharpened arguments. He sat in his chair like a judge behind a bench, arms crossed, his voice already rising as I entered. "Did you have to humiliate her like that? Did you have to enjoy it?" His words snapped like branches, and I almost laughed at the absurdity, because Rachel had done the humiliating herself, yet somehow I was the spectacle he couldn't forgive. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I laid out the facts, one by one, like cards on a table. The stolen memo. The private email leaks. The vendor expense that doubled as a shopping spree. My father shook his head at each one, not because he didn't believe them, but because believing them meant acknowledging that the daughter he had glorified was fallible. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "Even if she made mistakes, she's family. You don't betray family." I felt the air crackle with the weight of that hypocrisy, because for years betrayal had been his specialty, betraying my effort by dismissing it, betraying my worth by measuring it against Rachel, betraying fairness by demanding I carry the weight of silence. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Maybe I just learned betrayal from the best." The room froze. My mother's breath hitched, my father's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might actually strike me, not physically, but with words so cutting they'd scar deeper than any blow. Instead, he stood, trembling with fury, and pointed toward the door like a man exiling someone from a kingdom. I walked out without waiting for the formality of dismissal, the cold night air biting against my skin, and as I reached my car, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't my father. It was Rachel, and her message was brief, almost taunting. "Nice move. But you think you've won too early. Watch your back." I stared at the screen, the glow illuminating my hands, and realized that the dinner had been only the opening act. Rachel wasn't finished, my father wasn't defeated, and the real war was only just beginning. On Monday, the office air felt heavier than the summer storm pressing against the windows, and even the espresso machine sounded irritated, which fit the tone of the messages already stacking in my inbox, because somewhere between midnight and dawn Rachel had found a friendly ear in a second-tier industry blog that lives to spin corporate gossip into morality plays, and they ran a coy little item about an unnamed director who built her promotion on borrowed work, complete with a cropped screenshot that conveniently erased the timestamps and author field, which would have rattled me years ago when I still believed that perception outran proof. But I have learned that proof, when laid out clean and patient, walks straight through noise like it owns the hallway. I opened the draft Rachel had dangled and its full-thread sister with the headers intact, then forwarded both to legal and compliance with a factual note that read like a grocery list, and copied Richard because I needed him to see not just the documents, but the speed with which I handled them. Before the blog's comment section could warm up, our counsel reached out to the editor with the kind of gentle but unignorable nudge that makes publishers suddenly crave verification. And within an hour, the post wore a sheepish update about insufficient supporting material, which is a polite way of saying the story collapsed under its own cheap scaffolding. Of course, a retraction never travels as fast as a rumor, so I did not stop at defense. I pivoted, as I always do when the ground shifts, and put my own oxygen mask on by getting out in front with something that would look to the outside world like leadership rather than panic. By noon, I had a short internal note ready for the entire department, a calm, almost boring memo about a new authorship validation workflow we were formalizing for all strategic documents. Nothing flashy. Just a clear set of steps that credited contributors by name in the versioning system and locked every revision behind a digital signature, which meant the juniors who had been quietly mined for phrases would finally see their names threaded through the record like a spine, and it also meant that anyone who tried to launder work through charm would run face first into a wall of receipts. I paired the memo with a public post on my professional page praising 3 analysts by name for their recent insights and linking to a case study that contained those very authorship logs, which did 2 things at once. It put a spotlight on the people Rachel preferred to treat as background, and it made the gossip look not only wrong but lazy. Because nothing kills a whisper like a stack of open windows. Mid-afternoon, when the building settled into that post-lunch lull where keyboards sound like steady rain, I made time for a quieter, pettier move, the kind of surgical strike that never announces itself but leaves a lasting bruise where it counts. Under the polite heading of vendor relations, I called the boutique firm that had been dragged into Rachel's business lunch and asked them to rebalance the invoice into its correct categories, then suggested that we roll part of the credit into training hours earmarked exclusively for the 2 analysts whose time she had wasted. They were in the conference room when the account manager called back to confirm, and when they realized what I had done. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just precisely. The look on their faces reminded me that vengeance doesn't always need a drumroll. Sometimes it just needs a spreadsheet and a door quietly closing behind the right person. But the day's most important move was a test I had set in motion 48 hours earlier, a tiny string woven through 3 different channels that looked like the same sentence, but carried a unique tell in each version. A harmless update about a tentative client proposal that did not exist outside of my drafts. If the line ever appeared beyond our walls, I would know exactly which route it took to get there. Near 5 o'clock, the tell from the family group chat surfaced verbatim on a private account that often launders Rachel's side of the story into tips, which told me what I needed to know about where she was pulling from and who was carrying her water. I did not rage, I did not launch a public attack. I simply sent the account owner a short, polite message offering context on the imaginary proposal, attached the full document history that proved it never left my personal sandbox, and added the mention that our legal team had already logged the watermark variants for internal audit. The reply was instant and humbled, a promise to remove the post and be more careful, which translated to what I had intended all along. I salted the ground she had been using to grow her little stories, and I did it without breaking a sweat. On the way home, the streetlights blinked on in that steady rhythm that always makes me think of cul-de-sacs and block parties where dads carve grills like thrones and moms pass around casseroles with practiced grace, and I wondered whether my father had read the blog post, the update, any of it, or whether he had decided to live in the earlier version of reality because it made his favorite role easier to play. I did not have to wait long for the answer. A black sedan I recognized as his pulled up behind my car as I parked, and he stepped out holding a thick envelope the way a referee holds a penalty flag, one hand shaking not from age, but from the effort of mastering his temper. He did not ask to come in. He told me we were done until I apologized to Rachel and made a public statement, correcting the record, a phrase that tasted like cardboard in his mouth but sounded exactly like her. And then he pressed the envelope into my hands and said the words that finally made my stomach drop. Since you insist on playing hardball, you can deal with her attorney. I slid a finger under the seal because I thought it would steady me, but as the papers fanned open under the porch light, what I saw was not a cease and desist about gossip or a demand for a retraction. It was a letter that named me as a potential witness in an internal investigation I had not known existed, one that reached back years, one that did not begin with Rachel at all. And before I could ask a single question, my phone lit with a calendar invite from Richard for a board session first thing tomorrow. The subject line, a plain sentence that made my mouth go dry: discussion of historical ethics complaints. The boardroom that morning carried the sterile chill of a hospital corridor, all glass walls and chrome lines, the kind of place where truth is supposed to live in spreadsheets, but more often hides in tone, posture, and the weight of silence. Richard sat at the head of the table, not indulgent, not theatrical, just steady, and the folder in front of him had the thick spine of history that never stays buried. Around him were 3 board members who had seen more scandals than weddings, and their expressions revealed nothing beyond a faint curiosity, the sort one reserves for watching a chess match that might end in checkmate, but might also stretch for 50 more moves. I took my seat, spine straight, palms pressed together on the polished surface, aware that my name, my promotion, my credibility were all tangled in whatever pages lay inside that folder. And that Rachel's threats had not been idle bluster, but the first pebbles of an avalanche she thought would bury me. They began with a calm recitation of historical ethics complaints, a phrase bland enough to lull, yet the details under it were not bland at all. Years ago, when I was still clawing for relevance, an anonymous complaint had flagged that a junior analyst's work had been incorporated into a departmental strategy draft without credit, and, because the draft carried my login in the metadata, the complaint bore my initials like a tattoo. At the time, no action had been taken. The evidence was incomplete, the accuser vanished, and the matter sank into dormancy. But now, with Rachel stirring the ashes, it had returned like a ghost called back by her fury. My father's envelope had not been empty after all. It had been ammunition, passed through Rachel's lawyer, designed to make me stumble here at the very moment my ascent had begun. I did not fumble. I had anticipated this play ever since her midnight text with the cropped screenshot, and I had prepared the only antidote that ever works against smoke, receipts with dates, times, and authorship trails. I opened my laptop, projected the archival records of the same project, showed the edit histories, the timestamps, the moments when my contributions were logged and the analyst's additions folded in with my commentary. I explained, without raising my voice, that collaboration had been clumsy in those early years, that version control was not yet standardized, but that the substance of my work remained intact, and that subsequent validations proved it. The board members leaned closer, asked pointed questions, tried to test for weakness, and each time I returned to the same rhythm. Facts, not feelings, process, not passion. By the time I finished, the complaint no longer looked like an indictment, but like an unfinished puzzle with pieces missing. Richard closed the folder, not with finality but with a sense of measured closure, and his glance at me carried no smile, no warmth, just a professional acknowledgement that I had survived the test. Yet I knew survival in that room was not victory. Victory required something quieter, something that would make Rachel understand the war she had launched had already cost her more than she could afford. That afternoon, while others debated the outcome, I sent a private message to compliance, attaching the memo I had been saving, the one that listed not just Rachel's petty violations, but the larger pattern she had left behind. Clients she had strung along with promises she couldn't fulfill, budget approvals she had stretched for personal gain, whispers from vendors about special arrangements that read more like indulgences than partnerships. I did not embellish, did not dramatize. I simply placed the pattern into the system, knowing the system has a way of grinding slowly but thoroughly. Once fed. By evening, my father called again, but this time the voice that had always brimmed with command trembled with something close to desperation. He told me Rachel was spiraling, that she felt betrayed by everyone, that the family was cracking in ways he had never imagined, and he asked me, in a voice nearly pleading, to step back, to let it go, to salvage what remained of our bloodline before it turned to ash. I listened without answering, staring out the window at the city lights flickering like a constellation of false stars, and when he finally asked, "Did you do this to her?" I gave the only answer that felt honest. I didn't do this to her, Dad. I just stopped covering what she was already doing to herself. The silence that followed stretched long, and then the line went dead, not with anger but with the sound of a man who had finally run out of defenses. I set the phone down, not triumphant, not relieved, but oddly empty, because revenge, even when clever and precise, leaves a hollow where satisfaction should live. Yet as I prepared for bed, another message lit my screen. This one from Richard. Board satisfied. Position secured. Consider this a turning point. The words looked neat, conclusive, yet I knew better than to believe in clean endings. Rachel was wounded but not gone. My father was silenced but not converted, and the uneasy truth was that families never dissolve completely. They linger like smoke in old curtains, like echoes in hallways you cannot quite escape. As I turned off the light, I thought of the dinner where it had all begun, of my father's smirk and his cruel little chuckle, of Rachel's absence that had loomed larger than her presence, and of Richard's calm declaration that shifted the room. That night had been a crack, and everything since had been the widening fault line. Now the ground lay reshaped, but I couldn't help wondering if I had secured a future or simply built a throne on shifting sand. My last thought before sleep was not of triumph but of uncertainty, and in that ambiguity lay the one truth I could not outmaneuver. Some victories taste like ash because they carry the aftertaste of family.